Make sure to hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any inspiring stories I share. The diner in Harmony Creek was alive with the gentle hum of morning routines. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon floated through the air, mixing with the chatter of regulars and the soft, nostalgic melody of the jukebox in the corner. Sunlight filtered through the wide windows, illuminating the red leather booths and creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. In one of those booths sat Ernest Grant. At 72, the lines on his face and the slow, deliberate way he stirred his coffee told the story of a life well lived but not without hardship. His military jacket, faded but unmistakable, hung loosely on his frame, the patches on it worn with time. It was clear he wore it not for show, but as a quiet reminder of his past and his identity. Ernest had recently returned to Harmony Creek after decades away. His doctor had advised him to move somewhere with lower altitudes to help with his heart and lung troubles, and he had chosen to come back to the state of his childhood. Though much of the town had changed, places like this diner still offered him something familiar, a sense of belonging, however small. As Ernest sipped his coffee, his eyes swept over the room. Near the counter, a group of older patrons whispered among themselves, their gazes occasionally darting toward him. "Isn't that Ernest Grant?" one said, his voice low but curious. "The boy who left right before Vietnam?" The young cashier, Danny, approached Ernest with a friendly grin. "Morning, Mr. Grant. How's the coffee treating you today?" Ernest nodded, his voice calm and steady. "It's good, Danny. Thanks." Danny hesitated for a moment before adding, "Thank you for your service, sir." His tone was earnest, and the weight of his words hung in the air for a moment before Ernest gave him a small, polite smile in return. For most, it seemed like just another morning in Harmony Creek. But beneath the surface, something more meaningful lingered. There were unspoken whispers of recognition, of respect for the quiet man in the corner booth. Ernest Grant may have returned quietly, but his presence was beginning to ripple through the community in ways he hadn't yet realized. The small diner in Harmony Creek, so often a place of warmth, fell uncomfortably silent as tension began to creep in. At the counter, Ernest reached into his pocket and pulled out his worn veteran identification card. Danny, standing behind the register, scanned it but frowned slightly when the system beeped. "Huh. That's odd," he said, trying again. Still nothing. Ernest offered a calm smile. "No rush, son. These old cards don't always work right." Danny waved his hand dismissively. "It's all good, Mr. Grant. You can pay later if you need to. And hey, thank you for your service." At a nearby table, two uniformed officers, Roberts and Lewis, exchanged amused glances. They had been watching the exchange with growing interest, smirks creeping onto their faces. Known around town for their abrasive attitudes, the officers were always eager for a confrontation. Roberts leaned back in his chair, his voice carrying across the room. "A veteran, huh? Must be nice to get special treatment. Too bad not everyone's as honest as they look." Ernest turned slowly, his calm gaze meeting Roberts'. "I've got nothing to hide," he replied evenly. The smirk on Robert's face widened as he stood and approached the counter, Lewis following closely behind. "Oh, we're sure you don't," Robert said, mock politeness dripping from his tone. "But you know, sometimes people like to throw on a jacket like that and play hero. Happens all the time." Danny, still standing behind the counter, shifted uncomfortably. "Guys, come on," he said, trying to defuse the situation. "Mr. Grant just moved here. He's been nothing but kind." "Stay out of it, kid," Lewis said sharply, brushing Danny aside. "We're just doing our job, making sure no one's pulling a fast one." The room grew noticeably quieter as the officers closed in on Ernest. Patrons looked down at their plates or out the windows, avoiding the brewing confrontation. But Ernest didn't flinch. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small weathered plaque and his VIC card. "This is all I have to show," he said quietly. "If it's not enough, I can leave." Robert snatched the plaque and turned it over in his hands, his sneer deepening. "What's this?" "A souvenir from the thrift store," he mocked. Lewis chuckled, shaking his head. "Or maybe it's something he picked up at a pawn shop. You know, for the aesthetic." The laughter between them grew louder, filling the diner with a cruel echoing sound. Around them, the other patrons sat frozen in silence, their discomfort plain but their courage failing them. Even Danny, who had stepped forward initially, now stood rooted to the spot, unsure of how to intervene further. Ernest remained seated, his calm gaze steady despite the cruel laughter echoing around him. His voice, quiet but firm, broke through the noise. "This plaque," he said, holding it up, "was given to me by my commanding officer after my second tour. And this card," he added, lifting the weathered VIC card, "is all the proof I have." Roberts leaned closer, resting a hand on the counter as if to loom over him. "Second tour, huh? You must have been quite the hero," he sneered. His tone was dripping with mockery. "Let me guess, chest full of medals, a parade in your honor, the whole deal?" Lewis chuckled loudly, slapping his partner on the arm. "But he's got them framed in his living room, right next to a shrine of old war photos," he added. But Ernest didn't respond to their taunts. He simply sat there, his expression calm, his hands resting steadily on the table. His silence only seemed to fuel Robert's irritation. He picked up the plaque from the counter and turned it over in his hands like it was a meaningless trinket. "You see," Robert said loudly, addressing the room, "this is why you don't just take people at their word. You never know who's really behind a story like this. Anyone can dress the part." Danny's voice cut through the room. "That's enough, Officer Roberts," he said, his tone trembling but resolute. The young cashier had stepped out from behind the counter now, his hands balled into fists at his sides. Though his face was pale, his determination was evident. Roberts turned to face him, an amused grin on his face. "Careful, kid. You don't want to get yourself into trouble. This is grown-up business." Danny shook his head. "No. This isn't right," he said, his voice stronger now. "You don't get to treat people like this, no matter who you are. Mr. Grant is a good man, and you're the ones embarrassing yourselves." For a moment, Roberts faltered, clearly caught off guard by Danny's outburst. But Lewis quickly stepped in, laughing as he said, "Look at this one. Trying to be a hero. Guess respect doesn't come with experience anymore." The tension in the diner was unbearable. Conversations had completely stopped, and all eyes were on the growing confrontation. Some of the older patrons looked down at their plates, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. Finally, Ernest stood, his movement slow but deliberate. The officers paused as he rose, their expressions shifting slightly. Though Ernest was smaller and older than both of them, something about the way he carried himself filled the room with a quiet authority. "You're right," Ernest said, his voice steady and controlled. "You don't know me. Maybe you never will. But let me tell you something. You don't earn respect by tearing others down. Respect is something you give first, or you'll never deserve it." The officers exchanged glances, their smirks faltering for the first time. The words, spoken so calmly, seemed to hang in the air. Then, as if on cue, the chime of the diner's door rang out, cutting through the tension like a knife. Everyone's attention turned toward the door, where a tall figure stood, silhouetted against the morning light. The chime of the diner's door echoed, pulling all eyes to the entrance. Standing there was Captain Moore, a seasoned officer with decades of service etched into his sharp features. The room seemed to shift with his presence, the weight of authority and respect following him like a shadow. Moore's eyes quickly scanned the scene, Roberts and Lewis standing over Ernest, the plaque on the counter, and the tension hanging thick in the air. Without a word, he stepped forward, his boots echoing softly on the diner's tiled floor. "Officers," Moore said, his voice low but firm. "What's going on here?" Roberts straightened, his smirk faltering. "Oh, Captain, we were just, checking things out. Making sure everything's in order." Moore's gaze landed on the plaque. He froze for a brief moment, then picked it up with careful hands. His expression softened as he studied it, recognition flashing in his eyes. "I've seen this before," he murmured, almost to himself. Then he turned to Ernest, his tone shifting to one of respect. "Mr. Grant, it's an honor to meet you. This plaque isn't just a trinket, it's a symbol of extraordinary service." Roberts and Lewis exchanged nervous glances, their earlier bravado vanishing. "Captain, we didn't mean any disrespect," Roberts began, but Moore cut him off with a sharp glare. "Disrespect? You call this professional behavior?" Moore's voice rose slightly, commanding the room's attention. "This man has served his country with distinction, and you two have the audacity to question his integrity? You should be ashamed of yourselves." The officers stammered, but Moore wasn't finished. "Do you even know what this plaque represents?" He held it up for the room to see. "This is awarded to soldiers who go above and beyond the call of duty. It's not something you can buy or fake. It's earned through sacrifice, something neither of you clearly understand." The silence in the diner was deafening. Patrons who had remained seated now looked at Ernest with a mixture of respect and regret, their earlier inaction weighing heavily on them. Moore turned back to Ernest, his tone softening. "Mr. Grant, I deeply apologize for their behavior. On behalf of the department, I assure you this will be addressed immediately." Ernest nodded, his expression calm as always. "Thank you, Captain," he said simply. Moore turned back to the officers, his voice like steel. "Leave. Now." Roberts and Lewis didn't argue. With their heads hung low, they shuffled out of the diner, the door swinging shut behind them. As the tension dissolved, several patrons began to approach Ernest. One older man extended his hand. "Mr. Grant, I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. Thank you for your service." Danny chimed in, his voice full of sincerity. "Mr. Grant, if there's anything you ever need, you just let me know." Ernest gave them a small, polite nod. "I appreciate it," he said quietly. Then, without another word, he returned to his seat, took a sip of his now cold coffee, and gazed out the window. Harmony Creek would remember this day. Not because of the confrontation, but because of the quiet dignity of a man who had already given so much, and asked for nothing in return. The diner gradually returned to life as the door swung shut behind the two officers. Conversations picked up, plates clinked, and the soft hum of the jukebox filled the quiet that had been left in the wake of the confrontation. Yet, the mood was different. Danny cleared Ernest's plate, hesitating for a moment before saying, "Mr. Grant, I hope you know we're all grateful for you. For everything you've done." Ernest looked up at the young man, his expression calm but kind. "Thank you, son," he said simply. As he prepared to leave, several patrons approached him one by one, offering quiet apologies or words of gratitude. Ernest accepted each gesture with a nod, never one to make a show of things. Outside, the sun had risen higher, casting a golden light across the small town. Ernest walked slowly down the street, his hands tucked into the pockets of his military jacket. His reflection in the diner's window revealed not just a veteran, but a man who had endured far more than most could imagine, and still carried himself with dignity. Harmony Creek would remember this day, but not for the officer's cruelty or the intervention of Captain Moore. They would remember it for Ernest Grant, the quiet strength he showed, the dignity he never let anyone take from him, and the lesson he left behind for everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. I hope you enjoyed this story. I'm sure you'll also love the next one. Click on the video on the screen right now, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this in the future. Thank you for watching until the end. See you soon.